folks. If you're joining us for the first time, you're very welcome. This is the Apologetics Academy, which I run every Saturday at 8 p.m. here in the UK, which corresponds to 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, or 12 noon Pacific. And the idea is every week we bring in different scholars, apologists, experts, speakers to present to us about different topics of interest to Christians, particularly pertinent to questions that concern whether Christianity is actually true. And we also critically examine and investigate other worldviews as well. And we try to facilitate and foster dialogue and debate and discussion in a non-threatening and friendly environment. And this week we have Ted Wright with us, who's going to be talking to us about archaeology and the Old Testament and how we can use it in apologetics. I'll just give you a brief indication of what's coming up in the next couple of weeks. Next week we have with us Dr. Robert Marks, who is well known to those of us who are involved in intelligent design at Baylor University. He is going to be talking to us about an interesting topic on the nature of omniscience, which I have no idea what exactly he's intending to present, but he informs me that he's going to be presenting some fun, easy math, showing there can be at most one omniscient being in the universe, and by necessity that being must exist outside of time. And he's actually published a peer-reviewed article on this. So I look forward to seeing what that's all about. And then the following week, we have with us Nick Peters, who is the son-in-law of Dr. Michael Licona, who's been on with us in the past. And Nick Peters is going to be talking to us about the resurrection of Jesus, an honor-shame perspective. So we look forward to hearing from him as well. And then the following week after that, September 17th, we have Lynn Wilder, who is an ex-Mormon, who's going to be talking to us about sharing the gospel with Mormons. So that's what's going on the coming few weeks. If you want more information, you can go to our website at apologetics-academy.org and click on online apologetics training. I'll give you the complete schedule, and you can also peruse recordings of previous webinars. So as I mentioned, this week we were blessed to have with us Ted Wright from Charlotte, North Carolina, who is an archaeologist. And Ted, do you want to just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background, and then you can take it from there?
Sure. Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me okay, Jonathan? Everything good?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. It's a great honor to be here with you guys today. Thank you for joining us, all those who have joined us. And a little background, my undergrad is in archaeology, and I studied at the Cobb Institute of Archaeology at Mississippi State University under Dr. Joe Sager. And so those of you who may be familiar with Near Eastern archaeology, Dr. Sager was the president of ASOR. ASOR stands for the American Schools of Oriental Research. Dr. Sager went to school with a very esteemed American biblical archaeologist by the name of William Deaver at the University of Arizona. So I got the honor and privilege of studying under Joe Sager at Mississippi State at the Cobb Institute of Archaeology. I worked as a lab assistant for the Lahav Research Project in southern Israel, doing lab work for a friend who has his doctorate under Dr. Deaver, and his name is Dr. James Hardened, and now and I know him as Jimmy, but Dr. Hardened is now an archaeologist now doing work in southern Israel, doing some amazing stuff. So I got to work hand in hand with Dr. Jimmy Hardened, and then recently I've been associated with an organization called the Associates for Biblical Research, an organization here in America, as a professional archaeologist. And in 2014, I joined their excavation at a site in southern Israel. Actually, excuse me, it's about 9 miles north of Jerusalem, not southern Israel, called Khirbet El Makadar, and it is in the West Bank. And I'll talk more about that later. But and in the past several years, I served as the executive director for crossexamine.org. Some of you may or may not know Dr. Frank Turek, who co-authored the book with Norm Geisler called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I was the executive director for that ministry for about 3 years, and then I was also the teaching director as well. In addition to that, I also have been a professor at 2 seminaries here in Charlotte, one Southern Evangelical Seminary that was founded by Norm Geisler, where I taught the Old Testament and archaeology for about, I would say, about 11 or 12, 13 years. And then I also taught another seminary here in Charlotte where I taught philosophy. So my interest in archaeology stems from my interest in the Bible, but also the integration of philosophy and how philosophy can help us to understand an ancient text like the Bible. Obviously, the debate is raging even today, but I'm very excited to share with you guys some amazing stuff that has come out in recent years that really throw light on the Bible and the Old Testament in particular, which is one area that interests me. The archaeology is interesting anyway, but the Old Testament has always fascinated me because of all the stories in it. As a kid growing up in church, maybe you heard stories yourself, but what I've discovered is that a lot of these stories are not myth. They really did happen. And I think there's a very high degree of accuracy in these texts. But so to kind of start us off, what I'm going to do is what I'd like to do is talk about something called, some professional scholars call it historiography, which is really, historiography is really the art and science of writing history. And I want to kind of preface the whole talk by this because, I want to let you know what I'm coming to the table assuming. I come to the table assuming that the text is given as it is. The people who are writing the biblical text are not trying to lie to us or anything. I'm sort of giving the text the benefit of the doubt, and like scholars used to do with any text in ancient times. So what we'll do is we'll go through the slides here and talk about history, and I like to talk about history in general, and then we'll get into the details. So this is actually a slide from the site there in the West Bank that's actually an old cistern. It's looking up, and it sort of reminds me of the story of Joseph in the well. You remember the story? Some of you may remember the Old Testament story, the Joseph and the coat of many colors. And so basically his brothers were jealous of him, and they cast him into a well. So it reminds me of a quote by the German novelist Thomas Mann, who said, "Deep is the well of the past." But history is important, and history is something that we don't think about a lot today in our modern world. We're so wrapped up with technology and wrapped up in our own that really, to really understand the past, we need to sort of take a break and think for a second about the importance of history, the importance of the past. Our ancestors believed that the past was sacred. And I happen to believe that as well. It's just, the word sacred just means holy. It means it's set apart. It means that it's important. The past is important. People have different views about the past, but certainly whatever your view is, we should show it respect and really listen to what it tries to teach us. The past is also, I would say, vitally important for moving forward. If we want to move forward, then we need to know about our past. And I'd also say this. And let me hang on. My computer is not. So hang on one second. The past is where we gain wisdom and truth. At least, hopefully, that's the case. Bear with me for a second. Seeing if my PowerPoint's not working. There we go. It is generally believed that the founder of history was the Greek writer called Herodotus. And the word historiography is a big word, but it literally just means the art and the science of writing history. And again, the general assumption by scholars today is that history began with the Greeks, that Herodotus was the father of history. But he says this in his histories: the purpose is to prevent the traces of human events from being erased by time and to preserve the fame of the important, remarkable achievements produced by both Greeks and non-Greeks. Interestingly, though, Josephus, who was a historian that lived a little closer to our time, said this. Let me back up. Sorry about that. Jumping ahead here. He said, "It is often said that the Greeks are the first people to deal with the events in the past in anything like a scientific manner, but it is clear that history has been far better preserved by the so-called barbarians than by the Greeks themselves. Egyptians, Babylonians, Phoenicians, by general admission, have preserved the memorials of the most ancient and lasting traditions of mankind." So here we have a guy writing 2,000 years ago that's telling us that no, not the Greeks. The Greeks were not the first ones to write history. We have other people, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Phoenicians, and I would even submit that the biblical writers were also able to preserve the past in a very clear and accurate manner. It's C.S. Lewis, I think he called it chronological snobbery. The fact that we think that today we are living in a period in which there is complete objectivity. But if you just look at anything in the news today, I mean, how do we know if anything is true? I mean, I would even say it's actually more difficult to ascertain truth from error today than it was in the past, because the proliferation of the proliferation of misinformation today on the web. I mean, anything. I mean, we've all heard the things of going viral. Well, a lot of things that go viral are just based on a lie. So at least with text and manuscripts, we can check these out by forensics and by archaeology and by paleography. The nature of history. What is history? I mean, it's a good question. We don't really think about this question, but it's a very important question. Is history everything that's ever happened in the past? Certainly that is an important aspect of it, but it can't be everything in the general academic sense of the term. Or is it the past only as it has been written down or recorded? That could be possibly history as well. But history by its very nature must be selective. I mean, obviously, we can't know every single solitary detail that ever happened in the past because, I mean, we just can't. It's just the nature of the limited amount of evidence that we have. So history by its very nature must be selective. I mean, if we're going to record something, I mean, one of the criticisms that people like, well, this is just their perspective. Well, yes, obviously it is from their perspective because obviously they're not concerned with, the history of the Chinese or the history of the whatever group. Any group that's recording something that's important, they're recording it as it's important to them. That doesn't mean that it's any less historical just because it's important to them. So history by its very nature must be selective, but it often focuses on events of great significance. Let's take, for example, an event in our recent past. This is actually, I don't think anyone was alive who's listening right now was alive during the Battle of Waterloo. But here is a historical painting of the Battle of Waterloo. But I don't think there's anyone that's listening right now who would doubt that the Battle of Waterloo happened. And so I would simply ask this question: how do we know the past? Let's just start there. How do we know the past? Because I don't think anyone doubts this. They believe that Waterloo happened. There are people today who are alive who don't believe that we landed on the moon. Who doubt that for various reasons. But let's just begin with how do we know the past, and we're going to begin with this very important historical battle in the past called the Battle of Waterloo, which was the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte by the British in the early 19th century. So we know the past through basically three primary ways. We call these historians call these primary sources. Primary sources. What is a primary source of the past? A primary source, number one, is eyewitnesses. We need someone who was there, who saw the event, who can record exactly what happened at this event. And in just the past few years ago, of course, many people were in New York on 9/11, that fateful day. There were lots of eyewitnesses, but there's going to come a time in which there are no more eyewitnesses to the 9/11 attacks in New York. But eyewitnesses are important in any historical event. You need someone to have been there, someone to have seen the event. So people, eyewitnesses. Number two, the second primary source are historical records. These would be written records that are left behind by people who saw something happen, who recorded it for their own personal use or for some type of official use. So we have eyewitnesses, we have historical records, and the third thing we've got are archaeological remains, artifacts. And these are what I would call primary sources. So we have eyewitnesses, we have texts, and we have artifacts, okay? So those are the three things that we're going to start with. These are the basics of historiography, the basics of history, okay? So let's go back to the Battle of Waterloo. This is taken from a newspaper that was in the British Library, the Caledonian Mercury, dated 3 July 1815. It was a letter from a private soldier of the 42nd Regiment to his father in the city. And they're just reprinting a letter from an eyewitness who was there at the Battle of Waterloo, printed in a newspaper. Now, maybe that's just fabricated. Maybe they made that up. I mean, why should we trust this? Why should we trust this newspaper? Well, why should we doubt it? I mean, why are we going to doubt that it's true? Well, it's not just the newspaper that we've got. We have other artifacts as well that corroborate what he says with what the historical record says. We have also published in 1815 the official account. This is actually, you can get this, you can find this as a PDF file. This is the Battle of Waterloo, containing accounts published by the authority, British and foreign, and other relative documents with circumstantial details previous and after the battle from a variety of authentic and original sources. A big long title here. to which is added an alphabetical list of the officers killed and wounded from 15th to the 26th of June, 1815, with the total loss of each regiment. Now, this is the official account, a report of the Battle of Waterloo from various sources, both British and foreign, French and other, Prussian, other people who were there at the Battle of Waterloo. So this is an official account. It begins, the very beginning of it, again, this is a historical document that purportedly was written by eyewitnesses. At the very beginning of the line, it says, on the evening of Thursday, 15th of June, a courier arrived at Brussels from Marshal Blücher to announce that hostilities had commenced. The Duke of Wellington was sitting after dinner with a party of officers over the dessert and wine when he received the dispatches containing the unexpected news. Marshal Blücher had been attacked that day by the French, but he seemed to consider it a mere affair of outpost, which was not likely to proceed much further at present, though it might probably prove the prelude of a more important engagement. So it's telling the very, very beginnings of what the major person in the Battle of Waterloo was doing at that time. So again, my only point here is to point out that we have eyewitnesses and we have historical records. Now, in this case, photography was invented in the 19th century. And before these soldiers died, there were photographs taken of them, and they actually wrote maps. And there is an actual map in that book showing exactly where the troops were at the Battle of Waterloo. You can check it out. Now, again, this could all be fabricated. This is all could all be a possible lie. I mean, it's possible that could be the case. But what I want you to see is the relationship between the eyewitnesses, the historical records, and the archaeological remains together make a very solid case for something having happened. In other words, there is in logic, there's two types of arguments. There's deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. So by using deduction or induction, by gathering all the data together, we can come up with a very high degree of probability that this battle really did happen exactly the way the historical records say. So again, we could go to Brussels, Belgium, or go to Belgium rather, not Brussels. We can go to the battlefield there and go to the Lion's Hillock that was erected in 1820, about just a few years after the battle. He gathered the dirt where the British position was and made a huge mountain with a big lion on the top of it called the Lion's Hillock. It was erected in 1820 by King William I of Belgium to commemorate the battle. And I'm sure if you go out there and excavate, you will find different pieces of battle gear and things like that. So again, we have the eyewitnesses, we have the historical record, and we have the archaeology all going together. And as I mentioned, photography was invented in the 19th century, and these were the last of the soldiers who actually fought in the Battle of Waterloo. They're old men now, and before they passed away, someone had the presence of mind to take their pictures. So these guys were the eyewitnesses before they passed away. These are actually men who fought alongside Napoleon Bonaparte in the Battle of Waterloo, and there are their pictures. So that's pretty remarkable stuff there. So now that's all fine and dandy. Let me give one more example, one other example, and I want to bring a little different nuance to this when we talk about eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological evidence. And here's the different nuance I want to bring. Of course, everyone remembers the sinking of the Titanic, it was. The year was, I believe, 1912. I forgot the date. I think it was 1912. But the RMS Titanic left England, bound for America to cross the Atlantic, and on its maiden voyage, it hit an iceberg and sank. Okay, of course, no, I don't know of very few people alive. I don't know if there's anybody alive today who I think the last of the Titanic eyewitnesses actually passed away. But there was a lady who was a little girl. I believe she was 7 years old. Of course, we've got this. Here is I believe it was a Morse code thing. Collision with iceberg. The British steamer Titanic collided with the iceberg, seriously damaging her bow. Extent not definitely known. These are radio reports from that time. Now, again, this could all be made up. There were newspaper reports as well. The sinking of the Titanic. And here is the little girl in the middle there with her parents. She was 7 years old when the Titanic sank. Okay, so remember the three important things for primary sources. We've got eyewitnesses, we have historical records, and we have archaeological evidence. Now, here's the difference I want to bring to this story here. The difference is that when the Titanic sank in 1912, there were conflicting eyewitness reports as to the nature of the sinking of the Titanic. Some people said the Titanic broke in half. This little girl, I forget her name. I think it was Grace, or well, it wasn't Rose like the movie, I don't think, like the movie Titanic. But in any case, she said with her mother that when the boat was going down, the Titanic went down, it broke in half. And of course, it went down in the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and no one knew for sure. Some people just said it sank, and other people said, no, the boat broke in half. Okay, so there's a picture of it at the time, depicting the boat going down in just a solid piece. Of course, before she passed away, she still clung to her story that she knows what she saw, and she saw the boat broke in half. So here we have we have eyewitnesses, and then we have historical records, and yet we have conflicting reports. One historical record, or one set of eyewitnesses says the boat broke in half, and the other eyewitnesses says, no, the boat just basically stayed together and sank. Now, what's the only way that we could know if the boat broke in half? Well, the only way we could know that is if we actually went to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And in 1987, American archaeologist Bob Ballard, he's actually an oceanographer. He went to the bottom of the Titanic, and guess what he found? He found the Titanic. And guess what he discovered? The boat was broken in half. The ship was broken in half. So what he did was, by using archaeology, in a sense, that's what he did. He was going back to the past by looking at this artifact, the Titanic, and he confirmed an eyewitness account that this indeed happened exactly the way the eyewitness said. So here's an example where archaeology confirms what an eyewitness account says. Now, is this every single case in archaeology? No. But this is the way that archaeology can function. It can function as a way of affirming if something happened, or maybe we don't have enough evidence, or maybe the evidence is not yet forthcoming. But there are dozens and dozens of cases, not just of the biblical record, but also of other historical events, of things that took place in the past that have been confirmed by archaeology. And one example I'll give very quickly, and we'll move ahead, is my grandfather. I grew up listening to stories of him telling stories about D-Day. Now, when I was 8 or 9 years old, I didn't really know what D-Day was. And D-Day was, of course, the largest amphibious military landing in military history. My grandfather was like 22 years old. It's a black and white picture of him. These are some photographs he took. There he is on the top left. He's actually the guy on the top left of that photograph. I like the guy with the knife in his mouth there on the bottom right. Pretty cool. There is a picture he took from his boat. He actually drove a Higgins boat, one of the landing barges that landed on Omaha Beach in Normandy. So I grew up listening to these stories. So my grandfather was an eyewitness to D-Day, and then when he passed away, my grandmother gave me all of his old stuff, and these photographs were in it. So now I've got historical records. And there's a picture of a German sailor that he captured on the bottom right. Their unit captured a German torpedo boat, and he happened to have his camera with him, and he took a picture of this German sailor. So all this stuff I got, and he also had things that he wrote in the book. So these are historical records from my grandfather. The one that's most interesting is this one here, and I'll just read it to you if you can't read it. June 5th, 2 a.m. till June 6th, 6:33 a.m. 28 of the most miserable hours I ever spent. We made the trip from Portland, England to France Beach in our 50-foot barges. Sea was rough as could be. 1944, wet and cold entire trip. So here is an eyewitness, or here's my grandfather writing a historical record, writing where he was, what he was doing between June 5th and June 6th in 1944. That was D-Day. That was when he actually was at D-Day. So this is a historical record. Now, my grandfather's passed away. He's an eyewitness, but he's passed away. So the only thing we have left is the historical record he left behind. And we also have the archaeology. So we could actually go to England, or go to France and Normandy, and we can see these are actually photographs, not that my grandfather took, but these are from the Library of Congress of this event, this momentous event. But if you go to Normandy today, you can actually see the remnants of the German positions there on the French beach. And we also have thousands upon thousands of soldiers buried there on the slopes of Normandy. So here again, archaeology, eyewitnesses, historical records, all coming together to really give a strong case for the event. So so with the primary sources, there are basically three views of this. You've got the historical positivists who say that you should never go beyond what the primary sources tell you. You have the new history. Primary sources can be supplemented with comparative data drawn from other disciplines such as sociology. A lot of this comes from like French social theory. And then you have postmodernism, which basically says that there is no reality beyond the text. History is mere poetry. So these are what postmodern historians say, and postmodern historians have infiltrated archaeology, especially the archaeology of the Near East. And one in particular is called the Copenhagen School of Biblical Interpretation, and it's also known as biblical minimalism. Primarily two scholars in Denmark, Thomas Thompson and Niels Peter Lemke. And so basically they say that Old Testament Israel is a complete fabrication. It's all made up. There's no evidence of it whatsoever. And so essentially, and we'll address that here in a minute, but the origins of it are interesting because it actually originates from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And essentially Heidegger influenced three famous French intellectuals, Michel Foucault, Jacques Lacan, and Jacques Derrida. So these guys have, some people may or may not have heard of them, but they did influence, history and archaeology. Foucault has been said is basically Heidegger plus Nietzsche. Lacan is Heidegger plus Freud, and Derrida is Heidegger versus his own style. So Martin Heidegger figures large into history and historiography and the approach to looking at a historical text. So obviously people who are influenced by postmodern philosophy, when they look at the biblical text, they look at it as mere poetry. It's completely made up fabrication. It's a story. It may contain good stories. It may contain moral stories, but there really is no shred of evidence at all for their historicity. For an excellent rebuttal for this, I would recommend a great book by an Australian scholar by the name of Keith Winshuttle. I love his name. It's a great name. And the name of the book is called The Killing of History, How Social Theorists and Literary Critics Are Murdering a Discipline. It's an excellent rebuttal to postmodern history. So I'd recommend that book if you want to read that later. Check it out. Excellent rebuttal to this. I don't want to address this today, but I just do want to mention it. So let's try to shift gears here for a minute. And I'm gonna quote another German scholar, Will Herberg. And this is from an article he wrote in 1950s called Biblical Faith is Heilige Geschichte. Love that word, great German word, holy history or sacred history. And but what he says about it is this. He says the uniqueness and the scandal of biblical faith is revealed in its radically historical character. He says the message biblical faith proclaims, the judgment it pronounces, the salvation it promises, the teaching it communicates are all defined historically and understood as historical realities rather than timeless structures of ideas or values. So what Dr. Herberg is saying is that that one of the things that is radical about Christianity is that it actually claims to be grounded in history, in truth, in events that really did happen. And I could not agree more. I absolutely agree with that. I would not be, in fact, I'm like C.S. Lewis said that if I were convinced that Christianity were not true, then I would be a Buddhist or I would follow some type of Eastern religion. And I do have a lot of respect for those, but I don't believe that they are true. I believe that Christianity is true. So that's why I'm a Christian, because I believe it is actually historically real. So let's talk about archaeology and what archaeology is. A lot of people see this guy and think that's what it is, but let's just, for the sake of time here, archaeology is the scientific investigation of the past using the material remains of past human cultures. This includes the recovery, what it means you've got to get it out of the ground, the cataloging, the analyzing, and the interpretation of artifacts. As such, archaeology is an auxiliary science of history. There is a difference between archaeology and history per se. Archaeology deals with material remains, and history deals with written records. Now, there is some crossover because sometimes they do crossovers, and I'll explain. So history is an investigation of the past by using primarily written records. But again, they both fertilize one another. Archaeology illuminates history, and history illuminates archaeology. So, for example, sometimes as an archaeologist, we'll find something in the ground that may have writing on it. Well, that's history, but it's also archaeology. For example, The Rosetta Stone, I mean, it's an artifact, but it contains writing. So it is part of both history and art and archaeology. Also, something called ostraca, which are broken pottery shards that contain writing on them. That would be both history and archaeology. Temple walls, palace walls, and such. But I think you get the idea that there is a technical distinction between archaeology and history, but there is a relationship between the two. So what is the role of archaeology in Christian apologetics? And I want to just say three things about that, and I'll come back to this as we go through some of these discoveries. Archaeology can do three things, I believe. It can affirm the historical basis of the text. Just like we were saying earlier, how archaeology, such as the discovery of the Titanic, affirmed what the eyewitness, the lady who was 7 years old, it affirmed what she said was true. Archaeology can affirm or deny that what the biblical writer said was true or not true. The second and third thing are actually very closely related, and that is that archaeology can illuminate the cultural background of the Bible, and it can clarify certain passages in the Bible. So think of the past as sort of like a dark room or a dark cave, and archaeology is like a very bright flashlight. So as you go back into this dark cave of the past, archaeology, it serves as sort of like a flashlight, showing us and revealing to us what the people of the past lived like. So the biblical writers obviously were people who lived, I mean, in the New Testament, it's 2,000 years ago, and in the Old Testament, it's about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. So archaeology becomes very important in understanding the cultural background of the biblical text. All right. So let's look at archaeology illuminating and clarifying the Bible. There's a passage here in book of Acts, I believe it's chapter 7. And what I want you to see here, and we're going to start with this because today we're talking about archaeology in the Old Testament. And I'm going to focus primarily on one area that has been neglected by a lot of apologists, and that is the Exodus and Conquest. But what I want you to see is this passage here, the very bottom of this. This is actually the speech of Stephen before the Sanhedrin. And it says, it's talking about Moses, it's talking about the Exodus and things like that. It says, Moses, in the yellow, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power. So I want you to see about that passage is this. Is that true? I mean, is there any way to ascertain that statement in Acts chapter 7? How do we know if Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians? Well, we've read, I mean, that book of Acts, depending on what, what your view of the book of Acts is, but even in a liberal view, it's written, at least 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. And so, obviously it wasn't during Moses' day, but how do we know if this is true? Well, we know it because of, let's go back to Napoleon. Very interestingly, come back to Napoleon. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte took his troops to Egypt, but he had the sense of mind to take not only soldiers, Napoleon also took scholars, and he took artists, and he took linguists, and he took people who were educated, people who could, record amazing things. So when Napoleon got there, he began to record all the art and all the artifacts and all the history of Egypt. Now, obviously, they didn't know how to read hieroglyphics, and they didn't know what these hieroglyphics said. So there was no way to know about Egyptian past because hieroglyphics had been basically lost until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone by Napoleon's troops. And then after Napoleon was defeated, the Battle of Waterloo, the Rosetta Stone went to the British Museum. And there was a race between the British and the French to see who was going to translate the Rosetta Stone first. And there was a young Frenchman by the name of Francois Champollion who was working in France. And there was another British scholar who was working in Great Britain, and they were on a race to see who could decipher the Rosetta Stone first. And as it turns out, Champollion beat the British scholar to it, and he was the first one to unlock the Rosetta Stone. This is very important because the Rosetta Stone helped archaeologists read hieroglyphics for the first time. And it was basically in 3 languages. The bottom language is Greek. The middle language is Demotic, not demonic, but demotic, which comes from the word demographic or democracy, means the people. So it's the popular language. And then the top language is hieroglyphics. So this was the key to unlock how to read hieroglyphics. And So when that happened, when Champollion began to unlock hieroglyphics, then it really unlocked the ancient worlds, in particular the Old Testament, and in particular statements like Moses being raised as Egyptian and things like that. We're able to now to see if there was any truth to the claim that Moses was educated in all the ways of the Egyptians. So when you take this layer of Egypt and you look at Egyptian history, you start to see some amazing things. It's sort of like looking at a text through ancient eyes. Before we understood Egyptian culture, and the only way that we can understand Egyptian culture is by using the hieroglyphics that were deciphered by Champollion and others. And so scholars began to flood into Egypt, and they began to unlock the temple walls and the palace walls and the mummies and things like that. Then we began to understand exactly what ancient Egypt meant. And I'll just point out a couple of things. This is actually the gold sarcophagus of King Tutankhamun, that was discovered in 1924 by the British archaeologist Howard Carter, working in the Valley of the Kings. But I want you to notice a couple of things here. I'm going to go back. Notice on his crown, I want you to notice two animals. You notice there on the right and on the left, there is a snake and a vulture. And I'll show it to you from a different angle. You see the snake and the vulture. Now you could look at that and, oh, that's beautiful. Maybe that's just decoration. But now that we know how to read hieroglyphics, and now that after over 100 years later, through translating thousands and thousands of ancient Egyptian texts and hieroglyphics, now we know what the significance of the snake and the vulture are. The significance is that basically Egypt was divided roughly into two parts geographically. The upper Egypt was in the south because the Nile flows. It's kind of confusing. The Nile flows from the south to the north. So upper Egypt was to the south, represented by the desert, represented by the vulture-headed goddess or god, and the snake represented the lower Egypt, which was in the Nile Delta. So the snake ends up, it was one of the main deities of Egypt. So whenever you see a pharaoh with a snake and a vulture on his crown, it means he's reigning over upper and lower Egypt. If you see a pharaoh with just a snake on his crown, it means he's reigning. It could mean that he's reigning over just the Nile Delta, or it could just mean that he is reigning, that the main god is on his crown depicted. So the snake becomes important in Egypt. The serpent, it becomes important. Now, this is really interesting. We'll come back to this in a minute. First, I want to just kind of mention here, and I wish I had time to really unpack this more, but this is actually from the work of a friend and sort of colleague. I've talked to Dr. Petrovitch several times. We've emailed back and forth, and he's also an associate with an organization that I'm associated with called the Associates for Biblical Research. And Dr. Petrovitch, Douglas Petrovitch, has done some amazing original work of translating some hieroglyphics out in the Sinai desert. And he has done some original work. So I would encourage you to Google him and check his work out. He's an amazing scholar. And so I don't have time to get into all the ins and outs of it, but he did a lot of work, and I believe he is correct. And what he does is he looks at when the Israelites may have went to Egypt. And this is actually based on the original work that he's done, based on the hieroglyphics and based on monuments and archaeology. So the question is, and the big question on the Old Testament archaeology is whether or not the Israelites were ever in Egypt. Was there ever a conquest? Was there ever an Exodus, or was it just like a movie, just like what we see on with Charlton Heston, or did this actually happen? Well, Dr. Petrovitch actually does connect history and archaeology together, and places the abundance pharaoh as the pharaoh known as Sesostris II around 1887 to 1878 BC. This would be the abundance pharaoh. Sesostris III, he believes, is the famine pharaoh around 1878 to 1840 BC. And Amenhotep III, who the pharaoh whose rule began the year of Jacob's death. Now, again, I don't have time to get into this, but I'll be glad to send anyone some articles making these connections if you want to see this. But 2 years ago, at an organization here in the U.S. known as ETS, or the Evangelical Theological Society, Dr. Petrovitch gave a groundbreaking lecture. This is the first time this ever came out public, of his doctoral dissertation at the University of Toronto. And there is you can see this is actually, I do apologize about this. This is actually a slide of a slide. This is actually in a site that he has been working, doing some research on for some years. It's called Tel El Daba, or Avaris. He believes, and I believe he's correct, that Avaris is the biblical city of Ramses, mentioned in Genesis 47:11. It is the Nile Delta site where Jacob and his family moved in 1876 BC. Interestingly, an inscription on the shrine doors that is now in the Pushkin Museum dating to the 20th dynasty mentions a Wab priest of Amun who is located at the harbor of Avaris. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Avaris, or Avaris, depending on how you want to pronounce it, has been excavated by a Swiss archaeologist named Manfred B. Tack for many years. And here is another picture of that. It's actually right there. The Nile Delta, as the Nile flows out to the north, it fans out, and this is on one of the eastern branches of that. Interestingly, this city called Avaris is where we believe the Israelites were, where Jacob lived, where Joseph lived, and consequently where all the Israelites lived. And there's a lot of archaeological evidence to show this is the case. In fact, we believe this is also the same site of the Egyptian Pharaoh who chased after Moses and the Israelites, because I'll tell you in just a second, some amazing things have been discovered in connection with who we believe the Pharaoh of the Exodus is, or was rather. But what most interesting about Dr. Petrovitch's research is his original interpretation of these Egyptian hieroglyphics. And this is known as the Serabit stele found in the Sinai. And this is direct archaeological evidence of the Israelites in Egypt. This is fascinating. And here is his translation. It's right there in the middle, or actually kind of in the middle to the right, right in front of the donkey's head. This is the translation. 6 Levantines, or Levantines. The Levant is the area known as Israel today. Hebrews of Bethel, the beloved. That is the translation. So this is an Egyptian hieroglyphics dating to the time commemorating the entrance of Hebedeb's donkey, who was the brother of basically Joseph, who was the Pharaoh of Egypt, or actually the second in command, called the I forget the technical name for it. It's my mind is slipping me right now. But in any case, this is amazing inscriptional evidence of the Israelites in Egypt. And this is just remarkable. This has just come out just 2 years ago. And again, this was a packed room at ETS. And I would encourage you to check out the work of Douglas Petrovitch, a brilliant scholar, friend, and a great, great man. Check his work out. Pretty amazing stuff. But this is actually what he also believes he has found the Egyptian name, very possibly, of Joseph. His name is Sobek Himat, and I think I'm saying that correctly. An offering, and I'm going to translate, this is his translation to the right, an offering that the king presented, invocations, offerings of beer, bread for the king, spirit, Sobek Himat, member of the foremost of hand, controller of the entire land. And notice the reference, Genesis 41:41, exactly what the biblical text says, that Joseph was put in control of the land. It says in the bottom, he who has authority over every preeminent office. So again, this is direct evidence of Joseph and his existence in Egypt. Now, what's interesting, we know from the biblical text as well, according to the biblical writers, if they are correct, that Joseph, before he died, or actually he died, he was buried in the manner of the Egyptians. So he very was likely mummified like a pharaoh, and may have had a sarcophagus like a pharaoh. But he was taken to the Holy Land and buried in Israel. What's interesting about this is that, to our knowledge, we don't know if his body has ever been discovered. So it's potentially possible that we could find the mummified pharaonic-looking remains of Joseph. That would be very interesting. But even if we don't find it, we do have some amazing inscriptional evidence here of Joseph there in Egypt. So what this is, to go back to our passage in Acts chapter 7, is we have this amazing confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh. And you notice on the left, Pharaoh has the snake, and of course Moses has the staff. Now, if we look at the confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh in Egyptian context, And in Egyptian history, in Egyptian archaeology, it really begins to come alive. It's pretty amazing. And what we see is what we call a polemic, literary polemic, but an actual real event. Basically, it was a confrontation, a cosmic battle, if you will, between the gods of Egypt and the gods of the God of Moses, Yahweh. Here we see, again, this is actually from King Tut's tomb, a brazen serpent. And there may be also some connections in the book of Genesis. When we read in Genesis 1 in the story of Adam and Eve, that said there was a fiery serpent or a brazen serpent who appeared to Eve. And interestingly, this story of the brazen serpent comes up again in Numbers chapter 21, when the Israelites, as they are leaving out of Egypt, they're now leaving out of Egypt, and they began to complain. According to the text, they began to complain to Moses, they began to complain to Aaron, and they began to complain to God. We want to go back to Egypt. We want Egypt. We want Egypt. So then, according to the story, God sends fiery serpents out in the desert, and they begin to kill the Israelites. And you're like, what's going on? Like, why would God do that? I mean, didn't he just save them? Yes, he did, but this was sort of an object lesson, and he was kind of like saying, okay, you want Egypt? Well, I'm going to give you Egypt. You want this? So Egypt was the snake. So the snake is symbolic of Egypt. It's symbolic of slavery. It's symbolic of death, according to the Hebrew account, or at least from a literary standpoint. This literary motif of the serpent comes up again and again and again. Now it's considered, and it comes up in a lot of world religions as well, as a good thing. But it's sort of a symbol of evil and a symbol of slavery in the Hebrew account. So God sends the fiery serpents. But interestingly, it says there was actually a passage in the New Testament where Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, or he's talking to the religious leaders, and it says that, it's actually, he's speaking to Nicodemus. And Nicodemus says, he comes to Jesus, he's a Pharisee, he's coming to Jesus at night, and he says, Rabbi, how can a man be born when he's old? How can I be born again? And he says, you are the teacher of Israel, you're a rabbi, and you don't understand these things. And then Jesus said something very interesting. Let me go back. Before I get to that story, let me go back, and I'm jumping ahead of myself here. Let's go back to the story of the Israelites complaining. So back in that story, so Moses then goes to God and says, listen, there people are dying of the serpent bites. What do I do? So God tells Moses, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a brazen metal serpent, and I want you to wrap it on a pole, and I want you to hold it high up. And those who look to the serpent in faith will live. In other words, if you trust me, and if they look to me and repent, they didn't. I mean, it's sort of implied. It's not really implicit, but it's sort of implied, like, hey, look, have faith, believe what Moses says, place the serpent on the pole, and those who look to the serpent will live. All right. Seems kind of odd, but it's the very object of their disbelief that God turns around for their salvation. Because then, now let's fast forward to the story of Jesus and Nicodemus. Jesus said, he actually quotes that story in Numbers 21. He says, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man shall be lifted up, that those who look to him shall live. So Jesus, and there's actually another passage, a Pauline passage, where Paul says, he who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in Christ, Jesus our Lord. So Jesus literally became a serpent. He became a snake for us. He took our sins. He became the very emblem of evil for us. So there's a lot of fascinating, interesting parallels and interplays between the symbol of the brazen serpent in the Old Testament and the symbol of what that means in the New Testament. So I'll move ahead. Let's look now at the plague narratives. We look at all the 10 plagues. According to the Egyptian story, there were 10 plagues. The Nile turning to blood, the frogs, the gnats, the flies. All of these things represented a different Egyptian god. The Nile turning to blood. The Nile had 3 different gods associated with it. Hapi, Osiris. The frogs was represented by the god of resurrection. The gnats and the flies represented the Nile gods. The plague of cattle. Cattle were very important in Egyptian history and Egyptian religion. the plague of the cattle, the boils, and also hail and locust. And then finally, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. It was basically confronting the divinity of the Pharaoh himself. So the Pharaoh himself could not even keep his own son alive there in the 10th plague. So archaeology and Egyptology can bring illumination to the Old Testament and show us that this was something that had an Egyptian flavoring to it. You remember now the Israelites who had left out of Egypt, they were there for 400 years as slaves. I mean, they started out there living kind of nice. They were living with Joseph and his family. And then according to Acts, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph or his family, and they began to enslave the Hebrews and put them into bondage. So again, the Old Testament, in particular, the Exodus, has a very, very strong Egyptian flavoring to it. And that's exactly what you would expect to find if it was legitimate and if it was genuine. Again, archaeology illuminating the text. One last one that I'll mention here. This is actually a papyrus. You'll see there on the bottom right, there is actually in the middle of the papyrus, there is a picture of Anubis, who is the jackal-headed god to the right there, kneeling down, and he's actually weighing something in a scale balance. And I want you to know what he's weighing. The text says in Exodus chapter 8, throughout the whole narrative, it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then it said God would harden Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. And all it meant was it was sort of a euphemism by saying every time God would do a miracle, it would just basically harden him into his position of, I'm not letting them go, I'm not letting them go. But we see this refrain again and again, Pharaoh hardening his heart, Pharaoh hardening his heart. Well, is the hardening of the heart a good thing or a bad thing? Well, no, it's not a good thing at all. And even in Egyptian history, even according to Pharaoh's own religious documents, his own religion, hardening the heart was not a good thing. Because in the afterlife, when the Pharaoh died, his heart would be weighed in the balance. And notice on the left, in the left circle, this is a hieroglyphic of a heart. And it's weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Ma'at is it's an Egyptian concept known as, there's a lot of, it's hard to translate into English, but it has to do with law, order, righteousness, goodness. The Pharaoh was supposed to keep order in his country. He was the one that was selected by the god Osiris and the god Ra and all the gods, all the Egyptian gods, all the pantheon to keep law. He was literally God's representative on earth. He was God's shepherd king. He was a God king. He was the divine king. But the biblical text says he hardened his heart. He hardened his heart. And here we have the Pharaoh's heart being weighed against the feather of Ma'at, which also is translated as truth. And here is an actual excerpt on the bottom of the screen there from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And the line is this: there's actually a spell. There is no sin in me. I have not lied wittingly, nor have I done aught with a false heart. And the prayer is, grant that I may be like unto those favored ones who are round about thee, that I may be an Osiris, greatly favored of the beautiful God and beloved of the Lord of the worlds. Now, notice there on the top, these are the other gods that are sitting in judgment looking over. And to the right, there is a crocodile-headed god who is ready to consume the heart if it is weighed and heavy and found unrighteous. Now, in order to protect the heart, there were scarabs. Now, these scarabs also represented Egyptian religion. And the scarab was also considered to be a symbol or an omen of resurrection, because really they were just little dung beetles that are living out there in the Egyptian desert, and they would come up. They would come up during the sunrise, and they would kind of be symbolic of coming out of the grave. But we found thousands of these scarabs in Egypt, and what's interesting is that we find them with little spells, religious spells from the Egyptian Book of the Dead on their back. So there's a little scarab on one side with the wings. If you flip it over, they contain these little spells. And do you know what the spells were meant to do? They were meant to keep the heart of the Pharaoh soft, because the heart was going to be weighed. In other words, please keep my heart soft. It was a spell to keep the heart soft. So pretty cool stuff there. And then, again, this is how archaeology, what I was saying earlier, archaeology illuminates, throws light on the biblical text. You can read the story now of the Exodus, and now when you read the Pharaoh hardening his heart, you see that, wow, there's a lot more going on here than just a story. There is an Egyptian connection there. So let's jump ahead now and talk about who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was. I'm just going to jump to the chase here for time's sake and tell you based on chronological considerations that we believe that the Pharaoh of the Exodus was Amenhotep II. And this code goes back to something I was mentioning earlier about avarice or avarice. And we know that Amenhotep II reigned in avarice with his father, Thutmose III. Now, Thutmose III, and I'll go to the slide here, this is actually an inscription here, a chariot from one of the palace walls of Amenhotep II. He was the son of Thutmose III, and Thutmose III was considered the Napoleon of Egypt. He was, interestingly enough, Napoleon keeps coming up. So Napoleon, he was basically a very strong, warlike type of a pharaoh. His father, Thutmose III, and Thutmose III, when he died, he left this, kind of great legacy that he was supposed to be warlike. So in the early 7 or 8 years of Amenhotep II's reign, he followed in his father's footsteps. He would make war in around the surrounding areas. He would actually show off his prowess and his skill with the bow and arrow and the chariot. And here he's depicted as shooting something like 5 arrows into one little shield here. They had these little things on the ground, and he would be at a full gallop with his horses and chariots, and he would shoot 5 arrows into one. So he was an accomplished charioteer and an accomplished horseman and an accomplished archer. He was he was somebody that you would not want to mess around with. But interestingly, in the 9th year of his reign, he basically doesn't have any more military conquests at all. In fact, in his garrison town, there's actually an area in Avaris that's been excavated. The archaeologists there, Manfred B. Tack and others, had discovered that his military essentially disappears in the 9th year of his reign. They're gone, and he does no more military conquest after his reign. Another interesting thing about Amenhotep II that really, and this is again, there's a lot of more information that I can dig into here. But again, I'll be glad to send you some articles on this. I have an article as to I can give you in my reasoning as to why I believe that Amenhotep II is the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But again, it's based on chronology. It's based on archaeology. But in any case, there's some really, really good, strong evidence that this is the guy, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and not Ramses II. One of these is that his firstborn son does not succeed him as Pharaoh. It was his 3rd or 4th son. We know that after Amenhotep II died, Thutmose IV was his successor. And how do we know that? Well, we know this from something called the Dream Stela, discovered at the base of the Great Sphinx near Memphis, Egypt. There it is, right there in the middle. It records the dream in which Thutmose IV, who was the 2nd or 3rd oldest son of Amenhotep II, was promised that one day he would be king, and that, quote, his reign came about through an unforeseen turn of fate, such as the premature death of his older brother. So in other words, he knew that, listen, I'll never be Pharaoh because, my older brother, but what do we know about the 10th plague? We know the 10th plague says that the firstborn of the Pharaoh even died as well. So again, this could be circumstantial, but it does fall in line with exactly what we know about the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, there's a whole lot more that I'm not telling you guys about, but let me just jump ahead and say this, because we're about to jump into something else that does connect Amenhotep II again with the Exodus. And the reason why is here's what I want to say, that the Exodus and Conquest stand or fall together. If there was an Egyptian Exodus of the Israelites, then we would expect to find about 4 decades later some type of military conquest, some type of entry culturally into the Levant. And that is exactly what we find. And we'll come to that here in a second. But before we go, though, I would like to show you if those those of you who would like to see it, all right, everybody raise their hand if they would like to see the mummy of Amenhotep II. Just simply raise your hand if you want to see it. If you're grossed out, you don't have to look at it. So turn your head. I'm going to actually show you the picture here. So very interesting. Is this the face that opposed God and Moses? And here is his mummy. There he is. You say, well, Ted, how do we know this is Amenhotep II? Well, it's very simple. Because his name was on his sarcophagus. We know it's Amenhotep II. Very interesting. So that's him. So what about archaeology affirming the Bible? What about this? And let's get now into the Conquest. And again, I want to go back here and talk a little bit about this, an important subject known as biblical geography. And the father of modern biblical geography is a scholar by the name of Edward Robinson, who lived between 1794 and 1863. Robinson took a trip from Egypt all the way to Lebanon with a missionary named Eli Smith. And Eli Smith knew Arabic, and so they traveled across the Middle East, and they discovered a lot of probably 80% of some of the things that were mentioned in the Bible were discovered by Robinson and Smith. One of them, when they got to Jerusalem, was something now known as Robinson's Arch. And you see there on the lower right-hand corner, this is on the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. And this little archway here this was actually leading up into the Stoa, into the area where the Temple Mount was in the first century. So that's the remnants of the archway of a stairway that led into Jerusalem. He discovered many other things. Well, there it is in the circle there on the bottom right. That's what's left of it. So very important guy. But the conquest of Canaan didn't really happen. So remember we were saying earlier that the Exodus and conquest stand or fall together. So if there was an Exodus, and let's just assume for the sake of argument, yes, okay, what if it was Amenhotep II? What do we find in the Middle East? Here's what we find. According to Joshua chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, we read about this, the first city that they came upon, the Israelites, as they left out of the desert. And remember now, according to the Bible, they were in the desert for about 40 years because they had sinned against God. And now they're wandering out in the desert. Now they're about to go into the promised land after that, and they're now going to conquer the land. So, but what I want you to notice here is what the text says about Jericho. The first city they came upon was Jericho. And it says, the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, see, I've delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and fighting men. And then jump down to verse 4. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns from the front of the ark on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, and the priests blowing trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, and have the whole army give a loud shout, then the wall of the city will collapse, and everyone will go up, and the army, will go up, everyone straight in. Now, what I want to just focus on for just a brief second here is the last part of that text. The wall of the city will collapse. In the original Hebrew, the Hebrew literally says the wall will fall beneath itself. The wall will fall beneath itself. Now, obviously, people have translated that as, well, the wall just came falling down. Okay, what does the archaeology say? Let's look at the archaeology. Jericho is very well known. It's called Tel El Sultan, and it's found in Israel, and it's been excavated for over about 100 years or so. One of the first excavators of Jericho was a gentleman by the name of John Garstang. I believe he was a British scholar working with the University of Chicago. And Dr. Garstang excavated and believed he had discovered the fallen walls of Jericho. Now, people need to see this, that as we kind of look as a bird's eye view, looking from the top down, you see that Jericho, not only did it have one wall, but it had 2 walls. And not only did it have 2 walls, but on each wall, there's actually a rampart that actually leads up to the base of the wall. So we're talking about the rampart or the revetment wall would be something like 15 to 20 feet high. And then the wall itself would be another 50 to 20 feet high. So we're talking about 40 to 50 foot walls. So it's a very, very well fortified city, just like the Bible says. So according to the Bible, it says that the walls fell beneath themselves. So let me go back to John Garstang. So John Garstang, this guy, he excavated, again, it's a huge site. So it's a very, very large site. And the whole city has not been fully excavated yet. But where he did excavate along one of these walls and discovered that the wall indeed had collapsed, two sections of the walls. And the walls actually formed a ramp. Now, let's fast forward the clock here. Garstang discovered that in the 1930s. In the 1950s, another archaeologist came along, and she was using some new methods, some new excavation techniques, and she was actually a pretty good archaeologist, a very good archaeologist in her own right, and her name was Dame Kathleen Kenyon. And Kathleen Kenyon had excavated there, and she, in her final report, she basically contested Garstang's interpretation of the wall and the dating of the conquest. And essentially, what Kathleen Kenyon did was she pushed the date back, essentially redating the excavation of Jericho. But there was a glaring omission that Kenyon had made, and I'll talk about that in a second. But what I want you to see here, I'm going to show you a slide of what I was talking about. So this is actually sort of again, not the best example, but it's an artist rendition of what it would have looked like. And I want you to notice also another thing about this, very curiously, when you get into the biblical account of things, it says that Joshua and the spies of Israel, they went in to spy the city out, and it said that they came upon a lady who lived along the wall, Rahab, the prostitute, and she lived along the wall. And indeed, Garstang and Kenyon discovered that there were dwelling places along the wall, so that indeed matches exactly what the Bible says archaeologically. So that matches. And then also the bricks that have fallen down formed a ramp up into the city, like an earthquake or something made the walls come tumbling down. This is an actual excavation report from Kathleen Kenyon. This is a cross section. And I want you to notice there on the left in the red, that little triangle, that is what the fallen bricks would have looked like. So the bricks literally formed a ramp, and that little black sort of diagonal line going up there in the middle is sort of tilting to the right a little bit. That's the revetment wall. So that's the rampart, which basically been backfilled. So basically the red brick on the left, these are the walls literally that had fallen down that formed a ramp up into the city, and it happened the breaches were in two places. There at that place, and then up in the upper part of the city as well. Basically corroborating exactly what the Bible says with what the archaeological record says. But it's not just that. When Garstang and Kenyon excavated into the city at that level, they also discovered something else very, very peculiar. The city had been burned from the inside. And so whoever conquered this city did not take anything from the city, because in some of the storage rooms, they found jars, amphora jars, that still contained dates and different types of things that had been charred by the ash, but they had not been taken. And according to the biblical text, these things that were supposed to be usually taken in war, God told them to basically don't take anything in the city, burn it all, and give it to me as a burnt offering. And according to Leviticus, a burnt offering was like the first fruits. So the Israelites, it was sort of basically a recognition that God was the one who gave the harvest. It was an act of worship, and they were to offer it to God as an act of worship. So basically, that's exactly archaeologically what we found. We found that the artifacts there were not all the grain was still there. It's charred. It wasn't taken, and it's burned exactly as the Bible says. So pretty remarkable thing there. So I mentioned earlier, Kathleen Kenyon had redated the site. Well, why should we? Before I get to here, why do I think that Kathleen Kenyon was wrong? For the very simple reason, pottery. We date the name of the game in dating in Israel, in the Middle East, is pottery. It's called ceramic typology. And there was a certain type of pottery that was found there in abundance that she failed to record, but it's found there in abundance. And it's called Cypriotic bichrome pottery. And it's found there by the millions. And essentially, to make a long story short, what was going on at that time in about 3,400 years ago in the Levant with the Canaanite cultures that lived there. They were making a type of pottery that they liked from Cyprus, but it was locally made. Now, they know Cypriotic pottery that was bichrome, two-colored pottery, and that was imported. We know that. But whenever you find locally made Cypriotic bichrome pottery, we know that when you find it in abundance at a particular site, it will date that site to a particular date. Well, the dates of the Cypriotic pottery dated to the time of the conquest, the time that Garstang had originally stated. So why did Kathleen Kenyon not mention the millions and millions of Cypriotic bichrome pottery sherds that she found at Jericho? That is a mystery. I do not know, and in fact, no one knows. Dr. Bryant Wood was on a documentary recently, made a few years ago, and that was actually a gentleman there who was one of Kathleen Kenyon's doctoral students at the time. And he was asked by the interviewer why they did not record, why Kathleen Kenyon did not record the Cypriotic pottery. And he said, that's a good question. I don't know that answer either. Well, one can only surmise that maybe by recording this pottery it would actually show that the biblical record was accurate, exactly like the Bible says. I don't know her religious views. I believe she may have been agnostic or atheist. I'm not sure. But whatever the case is, she failed to record a very important piece of evidence that would support what the biblical record says. So I would recommend, there's actually some great articles written by Dr. Bryant Wood of the Associates for Biblical Research. He's done some original research on this. Dr. Wood's doctoral dissertation at the University of Toronto is in Iron Age pottery. His expertise is in that, and he actually has been published in peer-reviewed journals, Biblical Archaeology Review, Biblical Archaeologist, many other publications. And if you want to read that, then research that further, in which Dr. Bryant Wood challenges the interpretation, the Kathleen Kenyon interpretation of the pottery found at Jericho. So Jericho, I believe, we can strongly say that Jericho there's strong evidence that it was destroyed exactly like the biblical record says. So the second city, according to the Bible, that was destroyed was the city of Ai. Some people call it Ai, but it's pronounced I. And according to Joshua chapter 8, it was a classic ambush. According to the verses 27 and 28, for Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he had stretched out his spear until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai, and the livestock and the spoil of the city of Israel as booty for themselves, according to the word of the Lord, which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation to this day. Now, again, to piggyback on the work of Dr. Bryant Wood, who is a friend, a colleague, and a gentleman that I highly respect, he's done research on this for years, and there's been a search for Ai. There's been work by Dr. David Livingston and others searching for the biblical city of Ai. And there have been several candidates for the biblical city of Ai in the past, several decades that have been pretty much fruitless. But there are some biblical and archaeological requirements if the Bible indeed is correct. Again, I'm just going to go through these. These are some of the criteria that have to be true of Ai. Adjacent to Beth Aven, east of Bethel, there must be an ambush site, military significant hill north of Ai, a shallow valley, smaller than Gibeon, in the vicinity of Bethel. It must have been occupied during the time of the conquest. One of the candidates for Ai at one time was a site called Et Tel, but the problem with Et Tel as being Ai is that it was unoccupied during the Middle and Late Bronze Age. So it can't be Et Tel. There is one site, though, that I actually took part in the excavation, and that site is called Khirbet El Maqater. And the site has been excavated for about, between 15 and 16, 17 years or so. Here is the site overlooking. It's actually there on a little saddle in the West Bank. It's located just on the outside of a place where Yasser Arafat was born, Ramallah. And the question is this Joshua's Ai? And we believe that it is. It's actually located right there on a security road between, there is actually a Jewish settlement on one side and there is an Arab village on the other side. This is a picture of the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. So this site is 9 miles north of Jerusalem. This is where this place called Khirbet El Maqater is. And it fits every single biblical description of Ai that we read about in the Bible, and the archaeology backs this up very strongly. Again, there's the picture of the security road. So on your right is a Jewish settlement. On your left is a Palestinian village. So near Ramallah. And there is a picture of a security fence. So it's a very interesting place to excavate, to say the least. And I find it very ironic even that this site is at this location. It's a very fascinating place. We did have armed guards with us when we were excavating. So that also made it very interesting as well. So again, there's the biblical requirements for it. And let's move forward here. This is the Arab village known as Deir Dibwan, and there is the minaret, where the Muslims call to pray. We actually had Palestinians with us who were excavating with us, and I became friends with several of them. Here is a friend of mine, Hamed, or Muhammad is his nickname, or his nickname is Hamed. Full name is Muhammad. They're a very good friend. He is a connoisseur of great coffee, just like me, and we became good friends excavating there. This is along the Canaanite wall there at Khirbet El Makader. Fascinating place. So to this day, there are sheep that still graze on the ruins of Ai, or what we believe is Ai. And when we got there, one of the first things that we do is we do we get the level to see where the, just kind of a benchmark. And there's kind of just some basic archaeology there. Here is an actual overview of the site. And this was taken several years ago, this drawing. And there on the top of the screen, you see the kind of the dark marks there. These are the places that have been, and now since then there have been a lot more things that have been excavated. But on the top left-hand corner, it looks like a little square-shaped C. That is actually the front gate of the Canaanite fortress. So if you see this dotted line, that's the wall, the outer wall of the fortress. This dates back to the Canaanite period, and the site is a very fascinating site. But on the left-hand side there, the top square, where it looks like a C, that's actually one part of the city gate right there, the third square that came up. And this is actually me in that gate. So this is actually looking north. Interestingly, according to the biblical text, it says that Joshua and his army basically taunted the king of Ai, and there was a hill directly due north of that, where that arrow is pointing. There's a hill in which the armies of Israel would have topped that hill. Basically, they drew the armies of Ai out of their city gate. The gates were left open. And then there was another army, or another part of Joshua's army, behind the city in a valley. And as the other military came out of the city, the other guys came into the city and they burned it. And that's exactly what we find in the archaeological record. So it's a fascinating place. It's been excavated. A lot of amazing things have been discovered there. Lots of pottery. Everything pretty much matches exactly what we find. Here is our team. Dr. Wood is there with the Indiana Jones hat. This is when we're doing a pottery reading. We had some great scholars with us from Hebrew University in Jerusalem that joined us in our pottery reading. Here, this is our team and recording some of the artifacts that we found there. And this is the site also has a first century component as well, dating to the Roman period. This is actually a piece of Roman pottery that was discovered to the site as well. That's me holding the piece of Roman pottery. It was just brought out of the ground. There's also a 4th century Byzantine church and monastery that was discovered at the site as well, at the very top of the hill. What's interesting about this is that in the 4th century, the believers, the Christians of that time, they would build monasteries and churches on biblically significant spots. And the reason why we know this is because we also find a Byzantine church also at the site of Shiloh as well. So that's why we believe this is a very highly likely candidate for the biblical city of Ai. So another picture of the Byzantine church. There is the front steps of the church. There on the bottom left beside me is or Gary Byers, a great archaeologist, good guy. These are actually tessera or mosaic tiles that were uncovered, thousands of these things. They had mosaic floors in the church. It was a pilgrimage church on the way to Jerusalem as pilgrims would make their way to Jerusalem. There was also a olive press underground, as well as a cistern. So this is actually a little hole poked in the side of the cistern. And at the beginning, we looked at this inside of it. So water would come down and fill it up, and you'd have fresh drinking water into the cistern. This looking inside of this, from the inside of the cistern where the hole is punched. You can see where it's plastered inside of this. This is all at Ai. This is actually a cave that about, I think it's 7 or 8 or 9 skeletons were found inside of this cave that we believe were there during the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, possibly killed by the Romans. These could have been Jewish zealots, possibly. They were excavated. The skeletons were taken out. They believe they were women and maybe children. I'm not sure. Very, very tight squeeze getting in this cave. I had to crawl in there on my hands and elbows to get that shot, but it was pretty cool to see. If you're claustrophobic, you wouldn't want to really spend a lot of time in there, but it's an amazing place. But there are some significant discoveries at Khirbet Makader that I want to bring out that do tie this all together, and that is this one right here. Earlier I mentioned the scarabs. This scarab that was discovered at Khirbet Makader dates from the reigns of Thutmose III or Amenhotep II in the 18th dynasty of Egypt. Now we had this wasn't our interpretation of it. We took this to some of the top scarab and Egyptian scholars in the world, and that was their interpretation of this. And in fact, Christianity Today named this discovery in 2013. Our scarab was one of the top 10 archaeological discoveries of 2013, because what it does is it ties together Amenhotep II with the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and this is found at Khirbet Makader. So it's very possible that an Israelite, a Jew, living at that time would have had this in his pocket or something, and maybe this fell out in his pocket when they were there taking the city of Ai. So anyway, in any case, it's there. And what's significant about this is that the dating of it in archaeologically, it's not just some sensational discovery, because we date sites by pottery, and the pottery does match the Conquest dates. But what we really want is an object that's not pottery that will give us an independent dating as well. And this, again, was the independent object that confirms the date that we had placed at the site. And again, there's just kind of a picture of the scarabs. Also discovered along the wall that I was excavating along the Canaanite wall. That's my friend at Yale University, Matt Glassman. And Matt, if you're listening, I hope you're doing well, brother. That's his hand there. It's a bronze arrowhead on the left and a sling stone on the right. This was discovered along the Canaanite wall there at Khirbet Makader, there in northern Israel. Pretty fascinating stuff. There's Muhammad again, and met some friends. This is another one of our Palestinian friends there, and he had a beautiful, beautiful young Arabian colt that he was there at the site, and I asked him if I could take his picture. I love horses, and I thought this is a really great picture. There is our excavation team, the 2014 Khirbet Makader excavation team, and they went back this year. There's some more research being done, but it is a very fascinating place. This is Dr. Bryant Wood. Myself, it was a great honor to be with him and excavate with him. I want to end with this, and then I'll open up for questions if anybody has questions. One of my favorite scholars is Dr. Edwin Yamauchi at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And I want to end with this, what I call Yamauchi's fractions. To keep in mind that archaeology is still growing, and there's still more things that we're learning about and still uncovering. And so just keep in mind that only a fraction of the evidence survives in the ground, and only a fraction of the possible sites have been detected. So we're still finding new sites. And only a fraction of those sites have been excavated, and only a fraction of what has been excavated has been thoroughly examined and published. So there's a lot that we don't know, a lot of information that we're still discovering, and only a fraction of what has been examined and published makes a contribution to biblical studies. So there's a ton of information out there, a lot more evidence, and the more that we learn about, the more we find that the biblical record is absolutely reliable. And I'll put that up one more time, and I'll just end with this statement that I got from a friend. So I look at archaeology like this, and especially as it relates to the Old Testament. Obviously, there's people out there who say, well, you haven't found this and you haven't found that. Well, I would basically say this. I would say that, archaeology is by its very nature limited. It can't look at everything. There's only a limited amount of sites you can look at. There are only a limited amount of, times that you can excavate. But it's sort of like this. When you look at the biblical record and you look at the Bible, what has been sampled so far has basically shown that the biblical record has been accurate. It's sort of like if you have let's say if you have a factory and you're making these objects, and these objects are, they need to be quality controlled. Well, obviously you can't look at every single solitary object that you're making. You have to take a sampling of those. So every so often you will go on the conveyor belt and you will pull one of those objects and check it and make sure it's working correctly. Well, in the same way, the samples that we take in the Old Testament and the New Testament, between archaeology and the biblical text, show that the biblical text is grounded in historical reliability. It's an amazingly historically reliable document. More things are yet to be discovered, but I'm excited to, again, this is just, we're just scratching the tip of this iceberg, as I said earlier here. There's a whole lot more to be discovered, and this is just to kind of whet your appetite. Hopefully, I'm sure you've got a lot of questions, and we'll try to get to those here in a second. But in any case, to kind of wrap up here, to say what I think, archaeology can affirm, it can illuminate, and it can clarify the biblical record. And let's see here, I'll leave that. And let's see here, just wonder if anyone has any questions.
That's great. Thank you, Ted. Do you want to unshare your screen so we can see you full screen?
Okay. How do I do that?
Just click. There's a button right at the top there somewhere.
Which one? Stop here. Stop share.
There you go.
Okay, there we go.
So this is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to ask a question of Ted, there's a number of ways you can do that. You can submit it anonymously by hitting the Q&A button, or you can raise your hand and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with Ted and interact with him in that way as well. So we have a number of submitted questions, and we also have one hand raised. Let me go to Gordon Revolta in Scotland, in Edinburgh. Camera just disappeared.
Okay. No worries. Yeah, we'll look at some questions here.
We have Jay Curry asks, what were the literacy levels like in first century Israel? I've heard skeptics argue that the Gospels couldn't have been written in the land because of extremely low literacy rates. Does that have any truth to it?
Literacy rates in Israel at what time? During the first century?
It says first century Israel, yeah.
First century Israel. I don't know where that would have come from. I mean, we have a lot of information, a lot of text, a lot of manuscripts. So, I mean, that's an assumption that's just, where's the source of it? I mean, anybody can make a claim that we're not very literate, but I mean, what's the evidence for that claim? I would want to know what the evidence was. I mean, anybody can make a statement, but you should back it up with some kind of evidence. If someone says, well, there's evidence that Israelites were not very literate, well, what's the evidence of that? Where's the proof of that?
Right. A Muslim apologist, Yahya Snow, has been busy submitting lots of questions. He actually disappeared, so he's no longer here with us. But let me ask his questions anyway. He says, hi, Ted. Sorry I missed a lot of this session, but what do you think of the parallelisms between the Pentateuch and the Code of Hammurabi?
Oh, the Pentateuch and the Book of Hammurabi. Yeah, they're very, very interesting parallels. And one scholar in particular that I don't agree with everything he says, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that he points that he makes is Dr. John Walton. And this has been among Christian scholars and biblical scholars that are non-Christian. There's a lot of debate as to the relationship between ancient Near Eastern text and the biblical text. Which one came first? Now, obviously, and according to my chronology, the chronology that I hold to, I believe in Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, which if I'm right, that means, and I do hold to the conservative data that Moses would have written that during the time of the Exodus or sometime after the Conquest, something like that. So we're talking about. So obviously, there are some parallels with them. But that doesn't mean, just because they're parallel doesn't mean they're copied or anything like that. I know there's some there's continual questions about, did the biblical writers copy from people and just kind of make it their own? And to put it another way, who was that? Dr. Can I think of his name at the University of Bill Deaver. William Deaver wrote a book called "What Did the Biblical Writers Know and When Did They Know It?" again, what I would say is those are interesting questions, and they're not just questions that are related to the Old Testament. They're questions related to any kind of ancient history at all. The question could also be asked, what is the relationship of the Code of Hammurabi or the Enuma Elish or whatever in relation to the biblical text? But there's always sort of, when that question is asked, there's always like a kind of assumption of the biblical writers are sort of borrowing from that, but that's not necessarily the case. You have to look at, I mean, the most important thing in looking at any kind of paleographical writing is context, context, context. And I would say look at the archaeological context, look at the literary context, and look at what the claims are people are trying to make. So, I would say that we with the Pentateuch, what we have is, and like I was showing earlier, we have internal evidence from a literary standpoint that the biblical writers were original. Now, yeah, there were some interesting parallels between the Code of Hammurabi and the Ten Commandments, but it could be that God is communicating in a way that they would have understood in their culture. Their culture would have given them. It would have given them a way to understand this relationship, this new relationship with Yahweh. But even then, the biblical record, and especially in Exodus chapter 20 and the Decalogue, they're very different than what you find in any other ancient Near Eastern parallels. For instance, especially not just the Ten Commandments, but also as it's elaborated further on in the Pentateuch, the whole concept of Hesed or grace. You don't find that with in other gods of the ancient Near East. You don't find this idea of grace and mercy. You find they're very vengeful and wrathful and mean-spirited. Although the God of the Old Testament is sometimes, he's charged with that as being vengeful and wrathful and things like that. I would say that the opposite is true. When you actually look at the biblical text, what you'll see is he's very merciful and kind, and I think that's the point of Moses.
Let's go to Gordon. Are you there? Okay. I'm hearing a lot of echo. Jay, are you on your hand?
Hello.
Yes, James, go ahead.
Just Ted.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
Welcome. First question: is this the place where Reuben Bullard was looking at, or is that a different place?
Wait. There's someone's causing echo. Is
this site where Reuben Bullard was investigating, or is this a different place?
I'm not sure. Reuben who?
Bullard.
I'm not sure if he excavated there. Are you talking about? Are you referring to Kerbet Makader?
No. This would have been about 20 years ago.
Yes, I'm not sure which site you're into.
Okay, here I'll move on. When it comes to the historicity of the Pentateuch and also Judges, the quantity of people is often an objection that's raised. What's your opinion of apologist use of textual criticism to reduce those numbers down to smaller numbers? Like when we see the size of Jericho, and I'm not sure how many people that you think lived in Jericho, probably fewer than 30,000. If we take the numbers as they stand, we're looking at an army of 250,000 men. This seems like a real easy slaughter of Jericho, just go in there like ants and there's nothing left.
Yes.
So shouldn't we be thinking, is the text multiplied by a factor of 10? Did somebody combine the numbers of captains and hundreds? How does that work in your opinion?
That's a great question, James. Thank you for that. Definitely. And so it highlights a very important principle in this relationship between the text and archaeology. And let me make it clear. I make no bones about it. I'm a conservative, and I hold to a conservative view of the text, and I would even consider myself an inerrantist. But by saying that, though, that's not to say that sometimes archaeology can help illuminate even the text itself and give us insights into the text. That's not to say that the biblical writers are trying to, be, faulty or dishonest or anything like that. But sometimes we have to allow for the fact that they're writing and look at the context, and sometimes archaeology will bring illumination to the text itself. And in this case, with Jericho or with the case of the judges, sometimes archaeology may bring some illumination to the text. Now, again, there's two ways to look at this. You could say, well, I don't, to go back to Yamauchi, or Gleason Archer, if there seems to be an anachronism in the biblical text with an archaeological thing, we could either say, well, the archaeology is incomplete, or we don't understand the text fully. Maybe the text doesn't mean this, whatever. So, I don't think we should abandon our principles hermeneutically or philosophically, but I think we've got to be careful not to be dogmatic where dogmatism is not required. Hopefully that makes sense. In other words, we're gonna fight a battle and defend. Oh well, the Bible says this and it was this or whatever. I would rather. It's kind of like for example, I'm just going to use an example here. So let's say we have some group of people who thinks they may have found the Ark of the Covenant. And then we have another group of people who says, well, the Ark of the Covenant doesn't exist, at all. The Ark of the Covenant was destroyed, Well, as an archaeologist and as a scholar, I would at least want to, even if I thought that the people who had the Ark of the Covenant were probably crazy, I would at least want to look at what it said, and give the archaeology, at least give the benefit of the doubt and see what the archaeology and the science actually says. I don't think we should be closed-minded to what scholarship and archaeology can bring to the biblical text as far as that light goes. But again, I'm kind of sort of walking a knife edge whenever we have anachronisms or we have numbers or things like that. For instance, even the number of Israelites who left out of Egypt, right. Some people want to put it as like the millions or whatever. I'm not as dogmatic about that as I am. I would rather, I guess there are bigger, to use a Southern term, there are bigger fish to fry. It's like I would rather defend the historicity of it and die on that hill than argue and bicker over the numbers. And because we actually, that may come up later, but let's first look at the historical event first, and then let's look at what the numbers would look like later.
No. When we look at the account of Ai, they lose 36 men, and it's a big deal, losing 36 men.
Exactly. Yes.
That seems hard to dovetail with the idea of an army of 500,000 men.
Exactly. Yeah.
So would you say then there's something, whether a multiplication factor of 10 or Wyndham's idea of combining the officers with the hundreds of men, something
right
on there?
Yeah, obviously, it depends on where you fall into the numbers. If they have millions then, or hundreds of thousands, then yeah, but maybe the numbers were not as much. That was the whole point of it, was that they were outnumbered. And the whole point of the text, the whole point of the narrative, it wasn't that Israel was mighty. The point of the text was, if you look at the general literary flow of the text, that they were outnumbered. They were clearly outnumbered, and it was Yahweh who was on their side. That's why they wandered the desert for 40 years, because they didn't trust God. And now they're small, but they have God on their side, and they're trusting in God, and they are winning the battles, at least the first part of it.
Right.
Yeah.
But it just seems like, in as much as they are outnumbered, and we see the size of Jericho and the size of the other places mentioned in the Conquest, something's got to give, either the numbers or the archaeology. And if the archaeology is going to be solid, then we have to say, well, the original text is, on that premise of the original text is right, some copyist somewhere along the way has done something with those numbers.
It could have possibly been redacted. Yes, possibly. Yes. I'm an inerrantist, but that's, you have to correlate, and I hear what you're saying, and I agree with the spirit of what you're saying. Absolutely, that you got to look at you can't ignore the archaeology. You can't make the text say things that it doesn't say, but then again, you can't completely disregard the text either on the same side of things. So it's sort of like you had to kind of walk the balancing act between defending the historical reliability of the text versus completely throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Okay, I'll go and step in.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, James. We have Gordon Revolta now with us. Gordon, you had your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hey, Gordon.
Hello. Hi. Thank
Hi,
you very
Gordon.
much for your presentation. my question is regarding the Ipuwer papyrus.
Yes.
And it details, or it seems to detail the plagues, or some of them. I can't remember exactly what it says. How would you date that, or where would you date that? When would you date that? And would it be in line with Amenhotep II, or earlier or later?
Yes, that's a great question. That's an excellent question. The Ipuwer papyrus is well known, and I've actually have an article on that very thing, and just off the top of my head, I can't remember where it dated, but I'm aware of that, and there are some fascinating parallels between the Ipuwer papyrus and the plague narratives. So that I don't know off the top of my head where that dates, and I do apologize. But I would be glad. I think Jonathan may have the information. I'll be glad to send you an article on that, as far as how they date together and how they coincide together. But in any case, obviously Egypt goes. Egyptian history and chronology is based into different time frames. You have what's called intermediate periods, in which they're basically the Egyptians kept pretty meticulous records of their history until the country would go into sort of a chaotic state known as an intermediate period. And there were 3 intermediate periods in Egyptian history in which a foreign ruler, the Egyptians did not consider the Nubians as legitimate Egyptians. And whenever you would have a Nubian king of Egypt, they did not even record it in their history. So they call it an intermediate period. And there's and so the reason why I say that is that we got to be careful when we correlate Egyptian chronology with an ancient Near Eastern archaeology, because even that itself is still ongoing. Egyptologists and biblical scholars are not all in agreement as to the dates of Egyptian chronology, because even among evangelical Christian scholars, there's still not an agreement as to Egyptian chronology. I don't know if you've seen Gordon the video. I don't know if it came out in the UK, but there was a video here in the US called "Patterns of Evidence." Did you see that?
I don't know. All I remember, the place I heard the Ipuwer papyrus was a presentation on biblical archaeology by an American archaeologist that I can't remember his name.
Yeah, well, it's a British archaeologist named David Roll who's worked in Egypt, and he wanted to basically, he believes that the Exodus account and the biblical accounts are actually parallel. But he actually redates the Egyptian. He adjusts Egyptian chronology, and so by doing that, though, when you start shifting chronology in the Egyptian record, then you also have to shift it with the ancient Near Eastern archaeology. So the problem that I have with Dr. Roll's thesis is that if we're going to readjust Egyptian chronology, that essentially takes away the Exodus and Conquest from the archaeological record, because one of the criticisms that has been made for years against the Old Testament is that there's not a shred of archaeological evidence of the Exodus and Conquest. And now with the work of Dr. Bryant Wood and Douglas Petrovitch, there's now, and even the work of John Bimson, there's some great articles, in Charles Ailing, 2 British scholars. There's a lot of great information that's coming out that's really reinforcing the historicity of the Exodus, and even the Israelites in Egypt. With I don't know if you saw the slides that I gave from Douglas Petrovitch, but he's been translating these Egyptian hieroglyphics, and before he made these public, he actually went to the top Egyptian paleographers in the world and made sure that his understanding was correct, and before he made it public. And these are scholars who are not necessarily friendly to the biblical story or anything like that, but he made sure that his hieroglyphic reading was correct, and it was. So here we've got hard Egyptian evidence of the Israelites in Egypt. So I would say stay tuned as far as trying to reconcile dates with the Ipuwer papyrus or anything like that. Then we got to be careful about the chronology. But I'll find that out. And I just off the top of my head I don't know, but I'm familiar with exactly what you're talking about. And yes, there are some fascinating parallels between that papyrus and the biblical plague narratives. Great observation.
Question number 2, if I may ask, would
yes, sir.
be the Hiaparu verse and the Hebrews versus whatever word was translated in Petrovitch's picture, which I think was IBR, and then I don't know if in Egyptian Im is plural as well, but in that slide the letters IBR in the Latin script anyway were for the Hebrews. And I remember there's a wee booklet called the through the British Museum with the Bible, or through the Bible. It's to do with biblical archaeology and the artifacts that are in the British Museum in London, and one of them is just proposing this group of people, the Hiaparu, whether or not that's,
Yes.
is it not? And is that word the same word that's in Petrovitch's translation?
That's interesting. I don't know because, and I'm not a cop out, but only because because Petrovitch's translation is directly from the hieroglyphics, and I'm familiar with the one you're talking about. And I believe, was that a cuneiform tablet, or was that a Latin, or was that?
It's cuneiform, yeah, I think.
Cuneiform, yeah. So, the issue is with translating or transliterating, and Petrovitch. Again, so the Hebrew, I mean, it could, I guess the answer would be it absolutely could be the same word, but because the stem languages are different, cuneiform is different than hieroglyphics. So it could be referring to the same people, but I don't know for sure. I'm not a linguist or a scholar. I would trust Dr. Petrovitch or someone else who knows language, but even with language, I mean, you can do archaeology with language, and linguistic archaeology is fascinating. But it absolutely could be referring to the same people. We do know that the Israelites are mentioned, the Hebrews are mentioned, the Israelites are mentioned in any early ancient text, and there are more that are coming to light, in the record. So yeah, it's a great question, though. Excellent question. The British Museum is full of amazing artifacts. In addition to, of course, you get the Rosetta Stone as well.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks, Jordan. Take care.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Jonathan. And my battery's about to go dead on my computer, so I can maybe take one more question, probably.
Okay.
I've just got a little bit of juice left.
Okay, let's see. Scott Walton, what is your date or date range for the Exodus?
Great question. So the Exodus was about 1401 to 1406 BC, somewhere in that time frame.
Do you have any Josh Parikh in Oxford is asking, do you have any recommendations for an intro to Old Testament textual criticism?
Well, yes, absolutely. In fact, Jonathan, if we may, one of the things we can do, Jonathan, is I can, when you post this video, when it comes live, I can also post a couple of articles that I wrote on the Pharaoh of the Exodus and the dating of it, and it gets into more details with footnotes and books and things like that. But one book I'll recommend on Old Testament textual criticism is by Gleason Archer, A Survey of Old Testament Introduction by Gleason Archer. And an excellent book on Old Testament history is by Dr. Eugene Merrill, and it's called Kingdom of Priests, A History of Old Testament Israel by Dr. Eugene, Eugene Merrill, Merrill, Dr. Eugene Merrill, A Kingdom of Priests. It's an excellent book on Old Testament history. Very, very good. I'd recommend that. But the best one, again, is going to be the book by Gleason Archer on the criticism of the Old Testament. And so I'd recommend that book. Check that out. And I'll also post some articles on getting into more detail, because in a presentation like this, as short as this is, it's hard to get into some of the details. And I know that sometimes you lose people when you get into some of the really scholarly details. But there's some amazing stuff that's coming out to really show that these events are based in historical accuracy. So
I find it highly amusing that Yahya Snow, our Muslim apologist friend, has submitted a question on the Trinity again. He says, "What is the earliest archaeological evidence for the Trinity belief?"
I'll let you answer that one, Jonathan.
Yahya Snow is always.
Well, I would say I think I know an answer to that. I would say in the catacombs in Rome, they found Christian symbolism I don't know if there's a Trinity symbol, but I do know that they would use the anchor, the dove. Those are very, very early symbols of. But I would have to find that out. I'm not sure. Probably, I would say probably Byzantine, probably during the Byzantine period, because that's when they began to talk about it more in more detail, because it became an issue in that time. But around 320. I guess during the time of Constantine the Great. But of course, I know that's when a lot of people say that's when it was supposedly invented, but it wasn't invented during that time. It was just talked about. Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that?
On the Trinity, lots, but yesterday I was asking about the Trinity, and he's basically wanting fodder for his videos. So,
sure.
Okay.
James. So James, I agree with you. I see in the question there. Yes, 930 years from the founding of Solomon's temple. So I agree with that. So whatever that, and I'll have to look at the date. Actually, in my article that I wrote, and I don't have it just on the top of my head right here, and I wish I'd have made a slide for it. But I do have the thinking and the rationale behind my dating of the pharaonic of the Exodus, and I've got the footnotes there if you'd like to see the footnotes for that.
Very quickly, as a quick question, he's asking, what do you think of the prospect of finding earlier manuscripts for the Old Testament?
Oh, actually, very, very well, very good. It's just the thing about it is that there's so much. Jonathan, I'm not sure if your listeners are familiar with Dr. Daniel Wallace.
They will be.
Okay. Dan Wallace is an American scholar. He's a professor of Greek at Dallas Theological Seminary, and he's actually going around the Middle East, around Europe, and around the world, basically. And it's called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. But not only does Dr. Wallace study New Testament manuscripts, he's actually discovering new manuscripts for the Old Testament as well. And he's going into, they're digitally recording these manuscripts so that they will not get lost in case of war, or in case of the library burns down or anything like that. He's actually an amazing guy. And so they are discovering new manuscripts every year. And some of them are unknown. Some of them are unpublished. Many of them are New Testament. Some of them are Old Testament. But I do know that in the Dead Sea, there could still possibly be manuscripts around. There could be caches of manuscripts because of the nature of the Near Eastern desert out there. It's an absolutely fascinating prospect. And yes, definitely there could be some new manuscripts that were discovered from the Old Testament. Yes.
Also wants to know, do you have archaeological evidence that you would posit to prove the existence of biblical figures to atheists, with special emphasis on the Old Testament prophets like Abraham, David, and Solomon? He's obviously asking because he's a Muslim apologist, and they also accept those individuals as prophets. But go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So archaeological evidence of Abraham, yes, actually we do. We have not direct evidence of his existence, but of his time for sure. For instance, in the Ebla tablets, which were found in Syria, Syria, of course, is being controlled by ISIS now, and they're destroying things historically. But in Syria, back in the 1970s, the Italian archaeologists uncovered a huge library of archives known as the Ebla tablets. And Ebla mentions the 5 cities on the plain. And it mentions these cities like Sodom and Gomorrah and all the 5 cities on the plain, indicating that they were doing trade with these cities, which meant that they were in existence. So so at least it puts Abraham in historical context. And in addition to that, we also have other indirect evidence of his existence. For example, some of the cultural practices of the time were in existence of Abraham's day, like the teraphim of Rachel, some of the practices that you basically would take if you could not have a child, and you would have a child with your midwife or whatever. These types of cultural practices illuminate the time of Abraham and show that he was in existence in a real historical time period. But do we have direct historical evidence of his existence? We don't. But that's not a problem, because we don't have direct historical existence for a lot of people, but we still deny their existence. We can place them, though, in a very strong historical context.
Gordon Revolt is asking a funny question. He says, does Haman appear in ancient Egyptian text during the Exodus? Obviously, the background, but in the Quran, Haman appears in Pharaoh's court. And And
Oh,
so,
he does? Okay, yeah, I wasn't aware of that. Very, very
so him,
interesting.
of course, is a character in the book of Esther, and so the Quran is a slight anachronism going on at that particular point. Last question, and then we can wrap up real quickly.
Sure.
Abu Ayyub Shibeki is asking, some biblical scholars claim that the sanction for complete annihilation of the people in Canaan was to create fear in the other Canaanites so that they would leave. Later on, though, we see that the Israelites decided it was too difficult to expel all the Canaanites and decided to go ahead and allow them to stay. Wouldn't this then completely contradict the whole justification of annihilation?
No, I mean, no, it would not. It's that whole question is based on an assumption, and if the assumption is wrong, then the question is sort of misleading. The point of the conquest wasn't necessarily just to kill innocent people, because the Canaanites. Here's the thing, archaeologically too, that you have to understand. The Canaanites, whenever you hear that term Canaanite, people think of this sort of uniform culture. But at that time, in the 14th century BC, in the late Bronze Age, there wasn't a people known as the Canaanites. It was a hodgepodge of various people, the Ammonites, the Amorites. I mean, they were generally known as the Canaanite culture, but the unification was that their practices were very wicked. They practiced child sacrifice. There was incest. There was all kinds of evil that was going on, and so God was basically sending the Israelites in judgment against their wicked acts. The god Molech was worshipped, and these Canaanite tribes would place their children in the god Molech's arms. It was a molten idol, and they would sacrifice their children. So God sent the Israelites in judgment against them, to judge them, and God was using them. He could use anything, just like he used the Assyrians to judge Israel and to discipline them. He was using the Israelites to discipline or to judge these wicked nations that had come before God. Now, obviously, God is the only one who can do that. God is a righteous judge. But yeah, Israel did not do that. They did not follow through with that. And they were told that if they didn't do that, then they would be misled by their gods. And that's exactly what they did, because when Joshua died, Israel goes into the period known as the Judges period, and they began to intermarry, and they began to follow the gods of their foreign people that they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be a force of influence, but they ended up not doing it, not being committed to it, and not trusting God. It really came down to them trusting God. They didn't trust God, and so they did not drive them out completely. And they ended up being ended up making compromises and not being a force of good and influence in the land. So,
well, thank you, Ted. It's been great having you on this session.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you so much. It's been an honor. Take care, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. We can see the football playing in the background.
Oh, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Yeah, I'll post those articles on. There is a website, right, Jonathan, for the Apologetics Academy?
Yeah. If anyone wants the articles, then email me at jmcclatchy@apologetics-academy.org. You can find that on my website as well. And Ted will send me the articles, and I will pass them on to anyone who requests them.
Thank you for all those who joined us, Muslim and non-Muslim. God bless. Take care. Best wishes.
All right. Thank you, Ted.
Take care.